In today's Ranking the Ports video, we are checking out Capcom's very awesome and iconic 1989 release of Final Fight. So of course, just like any other massive arcade game back in the day, we would have lots of ports. Microcomputer ports, console ports, portable system ports, and so on. And of course, just like any other famous game, we would have a plenitude of very bad ports. Make no exception, Final Fight has its fair share of very bad ports. But anyways, without further ado, let's get on with this, and we're going to start from the worst of the bunch. Now, if you want to witness a total abomination, then the ZX Spectrum version of Final Fight is the right way to go for this. Is this pretty and vibrant like the arcade game? No. Is it playable? Does it control well? No. Does it deserve an official place in one of the Spec's worst ever games? Yes. Well, yes it does. No music in bland sound effects. This yellow and black load of trash was willingly sold to excited children, knowing the horror that it would cause for them. It truly baffles me how this actually got past the publisher's standards to release this at the time. I mean, really, I understand the Spectrum's limits, I love the Specky and its charm of 80s Britishness, but good lord, this most certainly didn't go down like Manic Miner now, did it? Back in 1991, when this was released for the 128K model, this actually cost £11.99 on cassette tape. If you were lucky enough to have a disc drive, this would have cost you $16.99. A brief look at Crash Magazine issue 93 actually claims that this upcoming port would be a fast-moving beat-em-up. You have just seen the footage of gameplay. Was this really that accurate? Now, initially, I played Final Fight for the C64 several years back just to see how terrible it really was. And yes, oh yes, this version is terrible without a doubt. Firstly, the arcade original drew in crowds at the time of release, just like myself, because of its larger than life sprites. These sprites back in the day truly were amazing to see. One thing that the C64 can't do too well is large sprites. So for somebody to think this would be a good idea for the C64 was clearly somebody wanting to cash in on the big successful coin-up game. As you can see, the sprites are extremely ugly, over-pixelated. The background is also very ugly with very dull colours used. The control scheme is also fairly shabby with this port. This version does allow to choose between all three main characters, but to be fair, each character is pretty bland. Of course, no music but very shoddy sound effects instead. Hitting enemies in this port doesn't feel satisfying like some other versions do. I'll be completely honest with you, Final Fight just didn't need to be on the C64 at all. I would have felt robbed as a kid if I had bought this port. Make no doubt about it, this 8-bit Amstrad CPC version of our beloved arcade game looks pretty good. The colours are vibrant at least. Playing and enjoying this game is a different kettle of fish altogether though. I played as Guy out of all three playable characters in this version. Guy just seemed to do what he wanted. The control scheme just seemed like it wasn't properly coded at the time. So yes, collision detection with enemy sprites was beyond lacking in that department. The game, as you can see, is incredibly slow, but not as slow as yesterday's Double Dragon video on the CPC, but nevertheless still very slow that the game feels like a chore to play rather than a memorable experience. Of course, no music or smashing down barrels to enter you into the slum stage. You are just plonked on the spot and away you go. Again, just like C64's version, the developer of this game likely knew that it was a shoddy port. I am not sure how you could say this was really playable. It's likely the type of release like C64 had, when as a kid you would pretend it was actually better than what it really was in reality. The Atari SD version of Final Fight looks good, but it really isn't a great game to play. Once enemies attack you as a gang, it is very tough to escape. Normally a special move can get away from situations like this in better ports, but the ST game plays so slow that controls just don't feel like they're responding to the button requests that you're making. As you can see through the gameplay, the game stutters as we move right to progress further into the stage. The ST version features its own theme tune for missions, which is a constant loop which easily gets annoying. You can however select and play as one of the 3 characters in this version, as of which I played as Guy. No sound effects by the way on this port, it's just not a good conversion, nor is it particularly fun to play. Of course, sprites are bigger than the 8-bit counterparts, but still doesn't do the game much justice. Collision detection is of course sporadic at best, or so it seems. Just a really terrible port, avoid this one. To be fair, the Amiga version of Final Fight isn't as bad as some will make it out to be. The game is deemed that bad that a coder recently made an enhanced version of it. Yes, by far not perfect, and yes, the control scheme is pretty messy. For example, the jump kick, you need to be moving whilst pressing the action button, which is pretty strange. Problem is that I found myself jumping more than I needed to. Color-wise, the source material by Capcom is a fairly vibrant looking game. The Amiga port is fairly washed out though. The boss at the end of stage 1 who whistles doesn't whistle to call his chums around. In fact, he doesn't jump backwards onto the wall either whilst his gang attacks you. That awesome part where enemies walk out of doors to fight you is also missing, and there is no introduction to stage 1 either. Instead, the game randomly starts and places you direct into a fight without any warning at all. Collision detection is average, not perfect by any means. The Amiga version by far could have been a lot better than this, especially given how colourful some Amiga games are. The conversion also lets you choose between 3 characters, just like the arcade original did. Now don't get me wrong, I think the SNES version or Super Famicom conversion is pretty great, but it's not without some flaws. Firstly, only 2 characters are playable in this version, which are Cody and Hagar. If you want to play as Guy, then the other version, which is Final Fight Guy, is pretty much the same game where you can choose between him and Hagar. Firstly, something that I noticed was slowdowns when the game becomes too busy with more than 3 to 4 sprites on the screen at once. But that is to be expected with some old games, and the Super NES is no exception for this. Musically, the game sounds fairly good, although not perfect. Collision detection is great. That feeling of hitting enemies feels right too. I originally bought the Game Boy Advance version from W.H. Smith at the time of the Game Boy Advance releasing in the early 2000s. Final Fight 1 is a slight revamp of the classic 1989 arcade game, and also features the ability to play as one of the 3 characters. The music has also had a slight modernisation, and prior to boss fights we now have some dialogue complete with close-up images of the person you're about to fight. A nice added touch. Game-wise, I rated this just above SNES because in essence it is the same game and only with some slight upgrades. The colours are nice and there is no lag when several sprites are on screen simultaneously. It is a very nice port and I was happy with it at the time, regardless of the awful screen that the first generation of Game Boy Advances had. Collision detection is also solid too on the Game Boy Advance. Enemies do walk through doors, and our friendly boss at the end of stage 1 even whistles too. As much as I mentioned whistling, I do think that is what makes the first Slums boss so iconic to Final Fight. What can I say about this version of Final Fight? After all, the title of this port is actually Final Fight CD. This was and still is mega. Of course, games being put onto CD rather than cartridge meant that game developers could put more data on, and with this came very awesome background music, which these days sounds very typical of that era. Lame, but awesome guitar music, which kind of encapsulates that era of experimental gaming. No longer do we have to put up with MIDI sounds, we have real studio produced quality audio in stereo, Nicam stereo if you will. Now, it could be debated that visually the game doesn't look spot on like the arcade original, but it is recognisable, and collision detection is arcade perfect in my opinion. For a 16-bit console pulling off a technical marvel arcade masterpiece from Capcom is an achievement in its own right. It's an enjoyable port and worth playing for the music alone. I am a sucker for games of this era with that, shall we say, 3DO sound. The game is mostly like the original game with enemies walking through doors, boss at the end of the first stage who whistles, so in that sense the Sega Mega CD conversion had enough space allocation to allow all these cool features without sacrificing much. If you haven't heard of the Sharp X68000, this was a Japanese microcomputer and good lord, it produced some of the best arcade ports of its time. In fact, the Sharp X68000 was pretty much the dev kit behind the CPS-1 arcade games, which is why this port of Final Fight looks, plays, and sounds just like the real thing. Japanese kids in the early 1990s truly didn't realise how amazing they had it. Meanwhile, around the rest of the world, we were pretending with rubber keyboards and attempting to control sprites to beat up some baddies, which never quite took place properly. As for the structure of this version, it plays and opens up almost identical, if not 100% identical to the arcade version you would have played growing up back in the day. So that's it for my countdown and my top favourite ports of Final Fight. So let me know in the comments what you think of my choices, my decisions, and what I actually said about each version. Do you actually have a favourite version on a particular platform? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching.